Steven. Hey guys, hey Jill. I didn't mean to say hey guys, hey guys. Hey Kiana. Okay, I see some people are jumping in now. How are you guys tonight? How's it going? I know that this is a little bit of a non-traditional topic that I normally do with these videos. Thank you, Jill. But I'll give it just a couple more minutes and then I'm going to launch into what we're here to talk about tonight, which is Blackhawk. Hey, Steve. Catch you later, Steven. Have fun. Hey, girl. Hey, Taquan. Okay, guys. So tonight's live topic, I've been putting it out there that I'm going to be doing a class instead of a discussion, and this was a class that I've done 3 times. The first 2 times I did it was at Camp Chesterfield in Indiana and Lilydale Assembly in Western New York, and it was something that I was very sort of uncertain about doing, and I'm gonna kind of explain and give you why, a little bit of context as to why I was a little bit uncertain about doing this. So this class is really about Blackhawk. We're gonna talk a bit about not only just who Blackhawk is, but we're gonna talk about Blackhawk. We're gonna talk about a figure known as Mother Leafy Anderson. We're going to talk about spiritualism. We're going to talk about root work and conjure and magic, folk magic, and really this class is about where folk magic and spiritualism, modern spiritualism, intersect. And really Blackhawk and Mother Anderson, is that intersection. And so Blackhawk is a spirit who is incredibly important to me and has played a role in the spiritualist movement, and so part of me kind of paying my respects and properly honoring the spirit of Blackhawk is me doing this class and spreading the teachings to as many people as possible, because Blackhawk isn't one of the things that's the most talked about, even in the world of root work and conjure, which most of what you see today with quote-unquote hoodoo is like, I'm not gonna name names. It's more contemporary. It's less old. It's less Southern. It's less Appalachian. And my teachers have been Southern and Appalachian, and that's the history that I want to try to preserve within it. So before we can do that, we have to kind of talk about, well, what is spiritualism? What is root work? What is conjure? If you followed my page at all, you know that I am a spiritualist. I consider myself a spiritualist. I will be a spiritualist till I take my last breath. I'll be a spiritualist after I take my last breath. Spiritualism is this. It's a movement that started in 1848 in Hydesville, New York. And it started with the Fox family. So in Hydesville, John and Margaretta had their daughters. The youngest 2 girls, Kate and Maggie, lived at home, and there was an older sister, Leah, who lived in Rochester, who was grown. There was a bit of an age difference between them, but the 2 youngest girls, Kate and Maggie, lived with their parents at this cottage or at this cabin in Hydesville, New York. And it was March 31st of 1848. That evening, they started hearing rappings. So what I mean by rappings are like knockings. And the knockings seemingly came from nowhere, and it was over the course of that evening and the consecutive days that there was sort of this communication, this code of communication that developed. And so it kind of became like, I don't know if specifically this was the code they developed, but it may have been like 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no. And eventually that turned into rapping out letters of the alphabet to give names and dates and answers to questions. And so people from all over started to come to witness this phenomena that was taking place at the Fox home. And it was a bit overwhelming, especially for young Kate and Maggie's mom. So what happened was they sent the young girls to live with their older sister Leah in Rochester, and the damnedest thing happened, that the rappings followed the younger sisters to Rochester, and it became known as what was called the Rochester rapping. So they were really the first modern examples of physical mediumship, and it started a craze across the United States of spirit communication and table tipping and seances, and eventually spiritualism became a recognized religion. So it's a philosophy, we consider it a science, a way of life, but a religion whose main basis is the idea that life continues after this thing, this physical change that we call death. And hey Danny, hey Daniel, and that through the vehicle of mediumship, we prove and demonstrate that spirit lives, that life continues, that personal consciousness and our individuality continue after this thing called death. So that's spiritualism. Now, I'm kind of going to gear the majority of what we talk about through a spiritualist filter, but we are going to talk a bit about Conjure and root work, and where spiritualism and Conjure and root work intersect, which, as I said, deals with Blackhawk and Mother Leafy Anderson, who we're going to get to. But I have to talk a little bit about what Conjure is, what root work is. Conjure, root work, roots, hoodoo, these are all names that all reference the same thing. It's a African originated American folk magic that was born out of the slave trade. And so how this came about is during the times of slavery, as slaves were being captured and brought to what was becoming the United States, specifically from West Africa, the Congo region, the majority of slave owners were obviously Christian. Now, depending on what part of the country you're in, most of it was Protestant. Some parts had a little bit more of a Catholic influence, which I'm going to talk about here too when we talk about the spiritual church movement of the South. But the slaves were more often than not required to adopt the religion of their slave owners. So they weren't allowed to practice their African spirituality. They weren't allowed to practice their religious belief systems. And so what they did was they sort of blended their spirituality, their belief systems, into the Christianity that they were forced to practice. And so things like Bible verses and hymns and psalms became works of power, and different spiritual figures or spirits or deities from their tribal practices may have become represented by the saints or the prophets of the Old Testament, like Moses or St. Peter. And it kind of became this blended thing. And the reason I say it's an American form of folk magic, some people say an African American form of folk magic, and I'll explain why I call it American versus African American, even though it absolutely is at its very deepest core African. And anybody who tells you otherwise is full of shit, and you need to run the other direction. That is a central core foundation to the work, and it's something that we must always respect, and it's something that we must always recognize. This is a practice that was born from literally blood, sweat, tears, enslavement, rape, murder. It's not something that came about as the result of a happy circumstance. And that's what a lot of folk magic is. You know, regardless of where you come from, what part of the world, we all have some form of folk magic going back to our history. And folk magic is about, it's about survival. It's not about calling corners and working intricate sigils and the planetary hours and ceremonial stuff. It's about, how am I going to ensure that I'm safe? How am I going to ensure that my children have food in their belly and that they don't go to bed hungry? How am I going to ensure that I have enough money to keep a roof over our head? It's not this elaborate high magic. It's, some people call it low magic, but to me, high and low, it's not one better than the other. It's just a different skill set and a different way of going about it and a different approach to what needs to be done. And so, as the slaves were here, they found, this is what's said, is that they found a kinship, a similarity with Native Americans of the geography of where they're at. Because here's one group of people who are oppressed and enslaved by white man, and another group of people who are oppressed and sometimes enslaved and murdered by white man. And they found that there is a commonality, a commonality, especially amongst their spiritualities or their indigenous spiritual practices. What's said is that a lot of the Native American influence on those West African practices in this melding of what would eventually become Conjure was the knowledge of roots and herbs, because a lot of the roots and herbs and the spirits of those roots and herbs that the African people used weren't plants and roots and herbs that were available in the United States. So they were able to learn sort of this herbalism from the indigenous people of the Americas and find a commonality between those medicines, if you will. Now, some people will say that it is not the what we would call Indian. It's not the sort of Asiatic descended indigenous people that the black African slaves learned from, but it was actually, and who knows what's true, I don't. I'm just giving you what I've learned. So what's commonly believed is that they connected with the indigenous people of the Americas. And I believe that there is a certain degree of truth to that. I have heard some people say that there was actually a group of black indigenous people from the Southern Americas, Southern America and Central America, who migrated upward at that time, and that it's their spirituality that was blended and sort of syncretized or synchronized or whatever the word is, with their African spirituality, because of the commonality of not only their black skin, we look similar, but the similarities between their cultural practices. It's also said too that a lot of the slave owners and colonists captured some of those black South Americans who migrated up because they thought that they were African slaves who escaped, and so there was sort of this enslavement of non-African people of color as well. For the record, I do want to say that we all know that Native Americans have, that there's a history in this country of genocide and wrongdoing, and rape, genocide, disease, illness, murder, all that stuff. But in some parts of the country, Native Americans were also enslaved as well. And I don't know how true it is, but I have heard that sometimes a Native American or an indigenous American person was actually worth the fraction of a cost at auction of a black slave. So these are two groups who have a deep, deep soul resonance with each other. Now, so you have African spirituality, you have indigenous spirituality melding, you have the slave owners' Protestant and Catholic spirituality blending together, depending on what part of the country you're in. Like in a lot of Appalachia, there's German influences, and the more north you go, and sometimes New England areas have more like of a Jewish influence, and every culture that immigrated to the United States brought their own folk practices that go back in their history, and it all kind of amalgamated together into this hybrid practice that is primarily African, that at its deepest taproot and deepest foundation is African in its nature, and it became known as Conjure. It's the work, it's the spirit, it's the conjure, it's the power. Terms like hoodoo were probably when they first came about, more found in like New Orleans, Louisiana, but it's hoodoo is more of a modern term. More than anything, you have to remember there wasn't even really a name for it. It just was a way of life. But if you did hear some sort of a name for it, it would be conjure, the conjure, power, roots, root doctoring. Sometimes a conjure worker would be called a root doctor, a two-headed doctor, a two-handed doctor. And so this, I'm kind of like laying the groundwork, laying the foundation to talk about how Blackhawk and Mother Leafy Anderson are sort of the intersection between these two. Now, I also want to say too, like I've talked about, yes, I am a spiritualist, but I also, as a personal, private practice in my personal spirituality, am a root worker or a conjure worker. And that is something that I avoided talking about for a long time because, especially in today's society, people are very sensitive, and a lot of old hurts, especially related to race, are coming to the surface. And so I have seen some things, especially in the realm of social media, where some people truly feel like unless you are Black or unless you are a person of color, that you cannot practice root work. And I have to say I disagree. Yes, root work at its core is African. No ifs, ands, or buts around it. It just is. However, we have to understand, a friend of mine made a post recently about how, yeah, colonialism and all that sort of came was a horrible thing, but the spirits didn't hold some sort of council and decide that they're only going to walk with people of a certain skin color. And so, your path will always claim you. Your path will always find you. And if you come from, as anybody who seeks magic, or usually as someone who comes from some sort of minority or oppressed groups of people, it's going to make more sense that you gravitate towards that. But I don't want you to feel like if you are, I'm a white person, so I can't practice. And that's, I felt a certain amount of guilt around that for a while. And the conclusion, I guess I should say, that I've come to, or what I feel around this, is that when Spirit calls you towards a path, when Spirit wants you, they'll call you. When they tap you on the shoulder, it's up to you if you answer or not. But Spirit isn't looking at the color of your skin. Spirit is looking at the content of your heart. And so I don't care if you are the whitest, straightest male who has all of the privilege, if Conjure is calling you, Conjure is calling you. And that's kind of how I feel about myself. I was a spiritualist, I was on my path, I was doing my thing, and, in regards to mediumship and psychic work. And I had no idea what root work or conjure or hoodoo was. And to give a little bit of my background and why conjure I think makes sense for me is I grew up Pentecostal in a charismatic church. And in my life, like most people who are different in some way, I was looking for something, especially in my formative years, and I was never able to quite put my thumb on what it was that I needed, but I was looking and I knew when I found something that wasn't it, but I didn't know what it was until I found it. Specifically in regards to things like quote-unquote magic. I know despite the fact that I was being brought up in a Pentecostal household, very conservative, fundamental home, I was drawn to, from the time I was a child, you know, as long as I can remember, to things of a mystical nature. So, and I've always sort of resonated with the sorcerer, mage, shaman, wizard kind of archetype. And so in my early teens, I explored Wicca and neo-paganism and a little teeny tiny bit of druidry, and while it was incredibly fascinating and there was something about it that stirred, that resonated, it wasn't quite right, because I found that I didn't quite, I wasn't quite into the, you know, you're cast in the circle and this and that. There was, the ritual of it didn't resonate with my spirit. And the other thing that, as much as I had for several years, especially in my teens, this flirtation with paganism, or this flirtation with things that might sort of be under this umbrella of witchcraft or witchery or Wiccan practices, even though you don't have to be Wiccan to be a witch, or a witch to be Wiccan, or, you know, they're not exclusive, or they're not the same thing necessarily. But the other element that I didn't really resonate with some of those practices was pagan gods and goddesses. And despite the fact that I was growing up in a Pentecostal household, I had a very hard time understanding this thing that we call God as a personal force, or as a personality, or as a being. And so that's one of the things that I think lended itself really well into me stepping into spiritualism. Not only was I mediumistic and practicing those gifts, but you know, in spiritualism we see God as this universal force and an impersonal force. It's not this humanized, anthropomorphized being sitting on a throne, and that made more sense to me. And so a few years ago, it's been about 5 years ago now, it was odd how it happens, and this is how it happens. This is how spirit works. I'm trying to remember the exact order of things, but someone gifted me a book, and he's a fellow medium of mine. His name's Phillips. He's sort of popular on the West Coast. But he sent me a book, and he said, someone gave this to me years ago. It never really resonated with me. Spirit told me to give this to you. And the book, I would get it out, but it's behind me. I don't want to move my chair. The book was Cat Ironwood's Hoodoo Urban Brute Magic. You know, it's a classic book, the green book. And like I said, at the time I had no idea what hoodoo root work conjure was. I was a spiritualist. I was learning more about that and the development of my mediumship. But the interesting thing about it was that it was a signed copy, so it was like extra special. I didn't even know what I had. I just put it away. I didn't even really look at it all that much. And then all these other things started to happen, which is why I say I didn't go looking for conjure. I didn't go looking to practice. I didn't go looking, as some people might say, to appropriate in any way. It's something that literally called to me, and I chose to answer. And other things that would happen was like I was at the bookstore, and this was like 2013, about 2013. And this book, like, flew off the shelf. And it was a book on Haitian voodoo. Now, I'm a white person, you know, my interest was not voodoo. I think it's a very beautiful religion. I respect it. I think it's highly misunderstood. It's not my path. It's not my calling. I've never claimed to be or to have. But it intrigued me, and there were other things going on at the time, like in pop culture, you know, like American Horror Story, Coven, that season premiered that year, so I thought, well, maybe it's just popular because of that or whatever. I put the book on the shelf. I go to leave through the part of the bookstore that goes into the part of the mall, and there's a table with that little book sitting on it right by the door, and so I bought it, and I found the history of it really interesting. And so as I was learning more about the history, not because I wanted to practice, just because I like to learn, that kind of led me into these videos on YouTube that started talking about root work. And I was like, well, wait a minute. This is this thing from this book that Bill gave me a while back. And so my introduction, I guess, into root work, actually, I never went in with the intention of learning the practices other than the videos that I was watching on how to make spiritual oils. And that sort of led me into learning about the literal herbs and roots that are used in root work, and the qualities and the properties that each of those have in making these oils that have intentions behind them. And from there, that kind of led me to the work of Mama Star, who was the primary person that I learned from. I did an apprenticeship with. Mama Star is a conjure woman from Texas. She is a conjure woman. Her mama was a conjure woman. And she's something else. And I've learned a lot from her. It started in an impersonal way. And I believe I ordered a book of hers. It was the old style Conjure book, or the Conjurer Workbook, the first one, which is and kind of was, but still kind of is, like my Bible. You know, there's so many works in there, and the thing about it, on one hand, it was fascinating because I felt like it was opening up so many doors, but on the other hand, it was really frustrating because unless you know Mama's just an old Southern woman, and she that's what she says, and she doesn't claim to be anything other than that, and she writes very much like she speaks. So that in itself can be confusing if you're not familiar with Southern culture and Southern dialect, which I grew up in a Pentecostal church where most of the people were from Kentucky, as was my family, so that part wasn't so hard. But because I, at that point, didn't have a firm understanding of the foundational practices of root work, it made making sense of her instructions a little bit hard for me. And so what I started to do was, at the time, she and several others like Orion Foxwood, who his book, The Candle in the Crossroads, I recommend as like a starting place for anybody who is interested in root work to start with, because it lays a good spiritual foundation for you to learn from before you actually start getting into the practices and the hands-on. You have to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and again, that this came from the blood, sweat, and tears of African slavery, and that's not something to be taken lightly. So Mama Star, and Orion and several others at the time were doing their blog talk show. And there's literally probably 100 episodes still on the internet, about an hour to 2 hours each. And I would just go back through the archives and start on one date and listen. And when I would sit and listen to their podcast, I would just take notes, because it was literally like being in class. And it helped make the things that I was reading in her books and her written teachings make more sense. And it was like things started clicking. The light bulb started going off, and it was making sense to me. And the other thing that really made me feel like, hey, in addition to spiritualism, I found my spiritual home with Conjure and root work, is the fact that because of that Protestant Christian influence, you know, and I'm just using this as an example, pagans, witches might work with gods or goddesses. You know, in root work, we work with saints and prophets, as well as some cultural spirits and folk saints. But instead of spells and invocations, we work with psalms and books of the Bible and scripture, because they understood that there were teachings if you learned to read between the lines. So it wasn't strictly that, and I still to this day don't consider myself a Christian because I am a spiritualist. It made sense to me because I was familiar with Christianity intimately, of growing up in Pentecostal religion, and Pentecostal was very prominent in the South, where a lot of these practices come from, and very much connected to the Black culture in the South, as well as what we call like the hillbilly culture here in the North. So that's what kind of led me in that direction, and why I say it chose me. I didn't go looking for it. But we must understand, again, and I cannot say it enough, I don't care what color you are, if a spirit calls you, if Conjure calls you, you're called. and it's up to you if you're going to answer that call. However, we must always respect and never neglect the fact that this is a work that would not have come about, that this is a practice that would not have come about if it was not for the atrocities of colonial movements and slavery, and that's just the way it is, period, point blank. And so in addition, in root work and in Conjure, there's a big emphasis on our ancestry and working with our ancestors, and I think that that is one of the major foundations too of root work. But we also must remember that it's not the ancestors of our blood. We have to honor and pay respect to and elevate and commemorate and give attention and healing and prayer to the ancestors of Conjure, to the people who were stolen from their families, who were raped, who were put on boats, crammed together like sardines, and driven across the ocean and forced into slavery and beaten and raped some more, and even up until the 50s and the 60s did not have all of the same rights that we as white people whose families immigrated here did. So point blank, period, end of rant. This is where we're going to get into Blackhawk and how Blackhawk found his way into both spiritualism and root work. So Blackhawk, and forgive me for I'm gonna try to pronounce his name, his true name. Blackhawk, which is his name in English, was born Makatai Mi Shikiakiak, which means black sparrow hawk, in approximately 1767 in a village called Sauk, which was near the Missouri River in Illinois. And Blackhawk was a medicine person, meaning, you know, we might think of them as a shaman, a medicine man, a healer. So at his core, Blackhawk is a healer. However, because of war and battling between neighboring tribes of Native Americans, specifically the Cherokee and the Sioux, he ended up going into battle at a very young age. And what he found was that not only did he survive battle time and time again, but that he was an incredibly skilled warrior. So much so that at the age of 15, he was given the title of honorary war chief, which is a big deal. And that kind of set the stage for how he would be known to the country, or at the time it was developing country. So during the War of 1812, it was James Madison who offered Blackhawk gunpowder. They wanted gunpowder. They offered him gunpowder if he would aid the English in that war or in that battle, to which he and his people did. And instead of given gunpowder, they were given things like blankets and things that weren't bad, but it's not what they were asked for. Essentially, they were tricked into helping them because the English needed their warrior skills to assist them. And in 1816, Blackhawk was presented with what he thought was a peace treaty, but he was tricked because, of course, the indigenous people didn't read or write in English, and they trusted people at their word. And essentially what it wasn't a peace treaty at all. It was a contract that said that he would sell the Sauk lands east of the Mississippi, and it forced his people onto a reservation. And those are two big things, but time and time again, Blackhawk and his people were tricked by the white people in power of the time, or the settlers who were in power at the time. And so throughout his life, Blackhawk never quit fighting, and he actually warred against the government of the United States and was good at it. He was feared. He became such a force to be reckoned with that he almost sort of achieved a celebrity status in, however much of the country was developed at that point in the 1700s. He was written about in newspapers. People knew his name because he stood up and he fought, and each time he was beaten down, he would still get up again and fight. And he died in 1838 under President Jackson. ironically, because we all know how Jackson was with the indigenous people or the native people. But so that was sort of the really sad and heartbreaking life of Blackhawk. He knew a life of betrayal, essentially, war and betrayal. So you have this person who is a very spiritual being, who is a healer, who's forced to become sort of this ferocious warrior on behalf of his people, who he felt an obligation to. And it was very sad. It was a very sad sort of a thing. Now, this is where we enter Mother Leafy Anderson. So, Leafy Anderson was born around 1887, and she was born in Wisconsin. And so I want to show you a picture here. So this is Blackhawk. And this here is Mother Leafy Anderson. So Mother Anderson was a person of mixed race. She was black and Native American, specifically Mohawk. She was born in Wisconsin, so she kind of was in the same general part of the United States that Blackhawk hailed from, and she wasn't born too far after, Blackhawk's time, and so there's sort of like that connection a little bit, a geographical connection. But when she became a little bit older, she moved to Chicago and she became a spiritualist, and she started to develop her mediumship. And she found that not only, Mother Leafy Anderson, that she had a talent for mediumship, but she was also a talented healer as well. But it was through her mediumship that she identified and claimed Blackhawk as her spirit guide. And so in 1913, she established the Eternal Life Christian Spiritualist Church. And then, under guidance that she felt came from her spirit guide of Blackhawk, in 1920, she went to New Orleans and helped sort of usher in these new charters that would become the spiritual church movement of the South, especially and specifically in New Orleans. Now, so in addition to having this sort of geographical connection, you have a woman of color in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So again, there's a parallel. People of color, oppressed people. Not only was she black or mixed, she was a woman at the time. So, talk about being a minority, talk about being oppressed. So there was, I think, on a soul level, a kinship between her and Blackhawk Spirit, which is probably why they chose to work together, even if it wasn't a conscious choice or a deliberate choice on her part. So, this, I think, is kind of where I want to talk a little bit about spiritualism in the North and spiritualism in the South. So when I talk about spiritualist churches, I talk about modern spiritualism as descended from the Fox sisters in Rochester and Hydesville. And if you go to a spiritualist church or a modern spiritualist church, you'll find that there is most of the time a very Protestant, very Christian sort of flavor to it, except, we just happen to talk to the dead people, during a service from the platform, from the pulpit towards the congregation, and practice the gifts of the Spirit. Now, the New Orleans, I wrote down here, I don't know if this was a quote or if this was just me taking notes here, but I wrote down here too, the New Orleans flavor of spiritualism often blends Roman Catholic icons, because remember, in New Orleans, they had there was a French establishment, and so French, Haitian, there was a lot of Catholicism already present. So the New Orleans flavor of spiritualism often blends Roman Catholic icons and priestly vestments with charismatic practices such as the laying on of hands and speaking in tongues. The mediums and the church leaders, often known as bishop or mother, prophesy, give spirit messages, and trans-channel their guides, who are often Native American. And the other thing, too, you have to remember, so you have this Catholic influence with the Catholic imagery that you find very prevalently in New Orleans, but a lot of the converts during that spiritual church movement in the South, that style of spiritualism, a lot of those who converted were, as I mentioned before, Pentecostal, who are much more charismatic, if you've ever been to a Pentecostal church. So their style was interesting variant or an interesting flavor of the spiritualism that's still practiced today, but as we might have known it in the North at that particular period in time. Now, I've talked in past videos about how spiritualists were, I say are, were, should still be, a very progressive group of people. Some of the very earliest spiritualists in the 1800s were supporters of free love, were some of the earliest of suffragettes trying to get women the right to vote, which eventually became, like modern feminism. They were very, spiritualism has always been very open and accepting of homosexuality, even as far back as like the early 1900s. We've always sort of strived to be on the leading edge of progressiveness. So it's not surprising that Mother Leafy Anderson's church was very female dominated, female led, female bishops, female owners, and Mother Leafy Anderson was really interesting in that during church services, she would often dress in men's clothing, tuxedos, three-piece suits, and sometimes there was almost this element of flare or flash where she would wear like shawls that were embroidered with the image of Blackhawk, of gold and purple, and there sort of seemed to be almost this gender defying kind of a thing going on with this female empowerment that was part of this movement through the Southern Spiritual Church movement. So very, very interesting, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But Mother Anderson was sought by people far and wide, not only for readings but for healings, and she would petition Blackhawk on their behalf because people would come who were being oppressed or treated unfairly, who were being mistreated by the police because of the color of their skin, and she would appeal or petition to Blackhawk to intercede on their behalf. And so Blackhawk's name became revered, especially through the South. And Mother Anderson didn't live a very long life. She passed, I believe, in, let's see here, 1927, and she was only born in 1887. 97, 07, 17, 27, so she was 40, not a very long life, but it was a very powerful and a very impactful life. Her successor was a woman by the name of Catherine Seals, and she established sort of the next step of that movement, which was called the Temple of Innocent Blood in 1922, which worked on behalf of Black women in the South, and she really helped to she didn't live much longer after Mother Leafy Anderson did, actually. I think she passed in 1930. But what she really did was to help establish Blackhawk as a bit of a folk saint and help cement him in the culture of the area, the culture of the time. Now, you're probably wondering, like, okay, so these are two interesting things. Really cool. Where do they intersect besides the fact that, there's a spiritualist connection, Mother Leafy Anderson, we're going to New Orleans. Well, that's kind of where this intersection takes place. So, as I said before, a lot of what we might know as hoodoo, that word is more New Orleans based in nature, but it was actually through root work not spiritualism, through root work that I first heard about Blackhawk. And as I started to build a relationship with Blackhawk, then it was only then, and researching Mother Leafy Anderson, that I found that he played such a role in spiritualism, because a lot of the Southern, and this is why you find him in Conjure, a lot of the Southern spiritual movement, the congregants and the practitioners also came from a culture where working roots wasn't something weird or odd. It was just part of their culture. And so they were both. They were spiritualists and root workers. And so Blackhawk really became a prominent figure for both those groups of people. And as I said, when you go down south, trying to separate spiritualism from root work is really hard because it's very blended, those practices and what it looks like. For example, I'm going to talk to you here in a minute about how do we work with and how do we honor Blackhawk. One of the ways that we do so is with a Blackhawk bucket, and which is sort of a variation, a modern day variation of a spirit pot, which is sort of an African practice. But in these churches, especially those who have, sort of Blackhawk as a patron, it's not uncommon that when you walk in, you'll find a bucket for Blackhawk. It's sort of like a shrine or sort of like an altar for Blackhawk. In some of these Blackhawk services, the minister, the preacher, whoever's giving sort of the message or the demonstration may dress up as Blackhawk and allow themselves to be embodied or trans-controlled by allegedly the spirit of Blackhawk to give messages and prophecy and readings and spirit connections. They light candles to Blackhawk. They'll work oils with Blackhawk. So to them, it's one and the same. They're not separated out. And so it's interesting that on my end, I kind of started with these things as separate things, and they ended up coming together. So this is where I want to talk a little bit about how do we honor Blackhawk, and then I want to end by talking very briefly about White Eagle, a figure known as White Eagle. So first, how do we know if Blackhawk is going to work with us? Well, first, I would say, before you even start working with spirits, you're either developing your spiritual belief system as a spiritualist, or you're developing a spiritual practice as a root work or as a practitioner of Conjure. And so with all the things that I've said, especially about respect in regard to where it came from, I would say more than anything, learn about what you're getting yourself into. If it's an interest, if it intrigues you, if it pulls you, that might be part of that calling. And if not, it doesn't, and that's okay. But if you do feel that sense to go a little bit more deeply into it, then do your research and do your due diligence, because you don't want to just start calling on spirits and throwing roots and herbs and candles together. You're going to get yourself in a mess. You need to know what you're doing. You need to know the forces that you are forming an allyship with, and you need to know how and why you do the things that you do. Once you have an understanding of spiritualism or an understanding of root work or an understanding of Conjure, they mean the same thing, root work and Conjure, then if you feel an attraction to, a draw to, an interest to Blackhawk, the first step is to ask. It's simply to ask. And so for me, some people say that Blackhawk is more inclined to work with people who have native ancestry. Now, I used to think I had more native ancestry than I do. It turns out I have much less than I thought I did, but even though I still have a little bit, I don't think that has anything to do with why Blackhawk chose to work with me. As I said, Blackhawk is someone who especially feels sympathetic towards people who are marginalized, oppressed, or who are minorities in some way. And so, yes, I'm a white male. I'm also gay. And so that, I think, played a role in it. My mediumistic sensitivities and my religious foundation of spiritualism, I think, was also a part of it, and probably the biggest part of it. So I would just simply ask, Blackhawk, I've heard about you, I've been learning about you. If I am meant to work with you, or if you are willing to work with me, let me know. And Spirit will let you know. The thing about Blackhawk that I've learned in my relationship with him is that in life, Blackhawk, despite the fact that he was a warrior, was a very well-spoken and elegant person. But from the spirit world, is not chatty, not verbose. It comes through, it's point blank, it's black and white, it's in your face, it's just a knowing. It just is. And so what I started to have happen was, there's certain tools that we're going to talk about that belong with the Blackhawk bucket. And I said, okay, Blackhawk, if I'm supposed to work with you, then you need to start bringing me the things that I need to use to work and build a relationship with you. And surely enough, people would just start giving me things. Hey, I know this is random, but I have this. Do you want it? I have been looking for one of those. I needed one of those. You might start having dreams and things of that nature. Now, I showed you that this is the, this image of Blackhawk. And I had asked Blackhawk to validate for me his presence with me. And I was actually having a reading, which I don't have very often, with a friend of mine who was one of the other mediums on Psychic Kids. And like one of the only other, it's like me and him are like the only two working mediums that came from that show. But, and we read for each other occasionally because it's hard for us to find good readers. And he's reading for me and he goes, and there's this spirit, I think it's like a guide who wants to come through. And he described, not knowing anything about my personal interest and the things that I was exploring, described this Native American with what looked like a mohawk on his head. And I just kind of grinned because I knew what he was talking about. Now, I also want to say here too that when I say a guide or helper, I do not mean in a sense that belongs to me, because Blackhawk, like other spirits, like John King in the movement of spiritualism, has been claimed by many, many mediums or many, many root workers. So there's lots of root workers who work with Blackhawk, there's lots of spiritualists who work with Blackhawk, and there's lots of mediums who feel as if Blackhawk acts as a personal guide for them. He seems to be a little bit universal in that sense, of that he doesn't belong to any one person. So, Mother Anderson, when she passed, Catherine Seals, worked with Blackhawk as a spirit guide. There is a Evan Powell, I think, was a physical medium around the same time who worked with Blackhawk as a control. And there's always sort of been this interesting relationship between spiritualism and Native spirit guides, Native Americans as spirit guides, back in those days. In a very politically incorrect way now. They used to just refer to them as helpful Indian guides, which we know is an offensive sort of a statement. We don't use those words anymore. But some people say that it's because Native Americans are deeply spiritualistic in nature, and they believe in an afterlife and interacting with that afterlife. So that lends them to being the ideal guides for those practicing spiritualism and mediumship. Other people say that, especially like in reference to the medium Powell, he was a physical phenomena medium, and they say because they had such a relationship with the earth and earth energies that sort of lended itself to the practices of physical mediumship and physical mediumship phenomena. The other confirmation that came is actually, I used to have a development circle, and we would meet every week, and we would build power as a group and work on our development. And one of my sitters one day came in and she goes, I have something for you, and I had this guide, this I think is a spirit guide of yours, come to me and asked me to paint him for you and present it to you. And this is the painting that she did for me. And when I saw it, I just had to laugh, because the reading with the medium who described the native with what looked like a mohawk on his head had just happened a couple weeks before. And then my sitter brings this to the development circle. And then, of course, this is one of the official portraits of Blackhawk. So it really was just confirmation of this is a spirit who's willing to work with you. So this is where I'm going to talk about the Blackhawk bucket. I mentioned that in the spiritualist churches in the South, when you would go in, you would find a bucket that was sort of used like an altar or shrine to honor the spirit of Blackhawk. Why he's in a bucket? Probably, as I said before, is a variation of the African practice of spiritual pots, but nevertheless, he's in a bucket. That's how they do it. That's how I was taught, and that's how I teach it. So I'm going to show you my bucket. I'm going to show you all the things that are in it, and then we're going to talk about why those things are in the bucket, how to put the bucket together, and then we'll talk a little bit about White Eagle before we wrap up for the night. And don't let me forget to give you some of the references as well. So what I'm going to do is try to flip the camera around here for a sec. Okay. So I'm going to try to stand out of the way so there's not that much of a shadow, but this here is my Blackhawk altar. This is my Blackhawk bucket. And the first thing you want to do, let me come down here. Okay. So the first thing you want to do is you want to find a bucket. Now, I've seen some people put Blackhawk in like a terracotta pot. I don't like that. That's not the way that I was taught. Metal holds energy, metal holds power. I like these. You can usually find them in the summer at like Walmart. They're often in the home and garden section, or they'll put them out around the 4th of July because people like to get these and put ice in them. Sometimes they're like longer and oval shaped. But the first thing is, if Blackhawk's supposed to work with you, ask him to bring you his bucket, and I promise you one will show up in your life if you're supposed to work with him. So this was my bucket. It's not my first bucket. I actually outgrew the last bucket when I started adding things to it. So a few years later, I got this bucket. Now, once you have your bucket, you need a representation, a physical representation of Blackhawk. So this is an actual likeness of Blackhawk. It's another thing I always say, if you're supposed to work with Blackhawk, the figure will come to you. This was from, I actually found this on eBay. It was from a historical series, a figure of historical figure. So this is literally Blackhawk, not just a generic Native American representation. But more often than not, when you are looking for examples of Blackhawk buckets, you'll see like a Native American bust, and that's perfectly fine. You will find the right thing that works for you, but you want some sort of an example of, or representation of, Blackhawk for your bucket. Those are like the two most important things. Next, you want a Vigil candle. So I just have like a plain red 7-day candle. You can get those online. You can sometimes find these at the dollar store. Check your Dollar Tree, check your Family Dollar. You can get them for anywhere from $1 to $1.50. I like to work with the plain red. The plain white emergency ones from the grocery store will do just fine. Now, some people, when they teach about Blackhawk, and working with Blackhawk, will teach you to work with the colors of red, white, and blue, and have you have a Native, an American flag in his bucket. Now, I don't know about you, and this is no disrespect to anybody who chooses to work that way with Blackhawk. I do not choose to work with red, white, and blue with Blackhawk because of how our country, our developing country at that time, and how our government abused and mistreated Blackhawk, and not only the Sauks, but all of the Native Americans at the time. Obviously, it's an atrocious history. So some people will use the American flag and red, white, and blue and say it's because of how much he loved his country and this land. But to me, land and country aren't necessarily the same thing. So when I work with Blackhawk, I use red, black, white, and occasionally I've been drawn to work with yellow. But excuse me here, I'm just gonna plug in so I don't die. But you want a candle to have burning in here. I obviously put a fresh one in for this because I wanted you to see the other one was quite burnt down. And then you want water. Anytime you work with any spirits in root work or conjure, you always want water as an offering. And of course, water is the lifeblood of humanity. Water is so incredibly important. So I have a little shot glass of water in here. I refresh it every week or as needed. I've seen some people put like bottles of water, plastic bottles, in their bucket. And to me, I don't like working with plastic and spirits. So it just feels too artificial. So I work with the glass container. And then in the bottom, what you want is you fill the bucket with dirt. Why we fill it with dirt? I don't know. That's just how I was taught, so that's what I teach. So you'll get your dirt. Any dirt will do. Some people teach sand. I don't like sand. He wasn't from an area where there was sand. It doesn't make any sense to me. I like dirt. In root work, we like our dirts. So once you add just your general dirt, you can then add other types of dirt. And eventually, as we work in this pot, and as we work with the spirit, and as we burn that candle, there's living flame, there's living fire. You know, this, not only the dirt, but the contents of the pot, build an energy. And so like, for example, to this, I have dirt from Illinois, where Blackhawk was from. I have dirt from the four corners of my home, the property, for additional protection, because remember, Blackhawk is mostly petitioned for things, yes, healing, but mostly protection, healing, justice, enemy work, because he was a warrior. I have a feather fan for cleansing, corn, because corn being very sacred to the indigenous people, and here's just some blue corn, a Native American prayer tie, antler, a native flute. Now this is interesting. This is just a flat rock that's been marked with blessed chalk and oil and prayed over, and underneath are certain people that I choose to hold down. No harm to them, but just hold them down so they don't create any trouble. And then as I petition Blackhawk, I burn the tea light on that flat stone each day. And there's other things in the bucket as well, you know, other things that I have felt called to give, other traditional offerings for Blackhawk, food items, corn, squash, candy, coffee, water, different sorts of breads and grains. Some people have fish and chicken, arrowheads, feathers, anything that you feel inspired that they would like, you can give, but you also want to learn about like the people and their culture and things that were important to them. The other thing too is you may want some sort of representation of the peace pipe. So like up here, I have more of an ornate peace pipe, but down here, I have just your standard corncob pipe, which you can get for like, I don't know, $2, $3. That used to have a price tag on it. I don't know what it says anymore. At gas stations or drugstores or tobacco shops. Double symbolism, because the peace pipe, being that he was a medicine person, and even though he was a warrior, did not like that he had to fight. And also the corn, because corn being very important to them, and also representing, you know, having what you need, having the things that you need. And so there's things that you can do with the peace pipe for any works involving settling arguments and keeping peace within the home, or keeping peace between certain people. So once you have, well, the other thing too is usually you'll find there's some sort of a hatchet or a small axe in the bucket. Now mine doesn't go in the bucket. I keep mine next to the walking staff, which can be used in calling the spirit of Blackhawk. There's another little one over here. But the hatchet can be used for cleansings, cleansing cords, cleansing illness, spiritual cleansings of any sort. It can also be used to petition Blackhawk for justice against those who've wrongdoers of different types, and maybe some harsher works, which I'm not going to get into. I'm actually not going to get into the works themselves. I'm just sort of giving you the basic premises of the tools that we use. So that's your Blackhawk bucket. So give me one sec here. Let me get myself seated. Okay. So once you have your bucket, your statue, your dirt, your candle, the first thing you want to do is you want to cleanse all of your items. One of the easiest ways to do that is just run them under cold water and then dry them off, let them air dry just a little extra time. I like to use sometimes too Florida water, or you can make some sort of a wash with different herbs and things like that. And then as you put it together, that's when you really just start praying and just asking, you know, I'm putting this bucket together with you. I would like to form a relationship with you. I would like to invite you to work in my life, and just start praying and putting power and energy into it. You also may want to look in the book of Isaiah. As I said, root work has a lot of Christian influences, and so Blackhawk is called the Watcher on the Wall, and that comes from a verse in the book of Isaiah. And I don't remember the chapter or the verse number off the top of my head, but you can pray those verses as well. And then once you have everything put together, then you want to call down the spirit of Blackhawk, and so he knows that this is a place where his spirit can rest as you work with him. And that's usually when you have the walking stick or the staff, or sometimes you may stomp or knock, which is kind of a symbol for knocking at the door to the spirit world, knocking at the door of the crossroads. And there's a prayer or petition that's traditionally used to call Blackhawk, which is just, Blackhawk is on the wall, Blackhawk is standing tall, Blackhawk, hear my call, Blackhawk is on the wall. You do that 3 times, and then as you light that candle, thank him for being with you, thank him for working with you, presenting those offerings, adding things to the bucket, and then just letting him know, I'm here, I'm open, this is a space for you, I choose to, you know, burn this light in honor of your memory and everything that you've gone through, and I'm ready to build a relationship from you. And spend some time each day. The thing with building a relationship with Blackhawk is he's not a formal spirit, and that there doesn't have to be this real formal or elaborate way of working with him. Just talk from your heart as you would your best friend. And you'll know if Blackhawk is around or willing or ready to work with you. You'll learn to recognize his presence. Like I said, he's not a chatty spirit. When he speaks, it just is. It usually comes through the form of just a knowing or a sense, or just a really strong thought that you know doesn't come from you. And they will tell you too, if Blackhawk is a spirit who chooses to work with you, they will let you know if there's other things that they want. You know, some spirits are picky. Some spirits like particular things as far as working with spirit from a root work approach, where they may request certain offerings or certain foods or certain drinks. That being said, I want to say that there is a big debate, because in root work, one of the traditional offerings for spirits is alcohol. And there's a sort of a disagreement, 2 sort of camps or schools of thought with offering of alcohol when dealing with Blackhawk. Because in the same way that native people's tobacco has wreaked havoc on white man's health, our alcohol has wreaked havoc on indigenous communities. And so some people say that you should not give alcohol as an offering to Blackhawk. It's a rule I generally abide by. I was taught that the only time that you give alcohol to Blackhawk or White Eagle as an offering is when you're trying to fire them up or get them extra angry when there's some sort of reversing work or protection work or justice work that you're trying to accomplish. So this is where I want to talk lastly about White Eagle, then I'll open it up for any questions that you guys have. So I was taught when I was learning from Mama Star, who I eventually ended up doing a apprenticeship with, that there's a figure known as White Eagle, who is the other statue that you saw back here, that there's a figure known as White Eagle, and that White Eagle is sort of like a counterpart or a spiritual brother, if you will, to Blackhawk. And I thought that was really interesting because here's, again, you have Blackhawk showing up in spiritualism and root work, and now we have this White Eagle reference because in spiritualism, we also have a White Eagle. And I guess really the question is, are they one and the same or not? My gut feeling kind of says no, but I want to talk about these different references. So there's a deck of oracle cards by Kyle Gray called Keepers of the Light. And, sorry, I don't want to lose you here before we're done, so I'm just going to plug in one more time. I'll hold the phone. So, in Keepers of the Light, there was actually a White Eagle card. And White Eagle was the spirit guide to a trance medium from the early 1900s by the name of Grace Cook. And Grace Cook, in her trance teachings or in her channelings of White Eagle, brought forward a lot of philosophy, which a lot of the White Eagle materials today are still found in spiritualist churches and spiritualist bookstores. But there was eventually the White Eagle Lodge was founded in, I believe, 1936, and White Eagle was her spirit guide. So in the Keepers of the Light Oracle deck, I'm just going to read you what was written here. White Eagle is a Native American shaman who is dedicated to honoring our heritage. He is a world-renowned spiritual guide who has been particularly cherished by mediums all over the world. He first spoke through the medium Grace Cook in the early 20th century. He is the guide who helped create clear channels in our bloodline and spiritual lineage so we can access the heart of Creator. He also helps us move into sacred ceremony where we can hold sacred space to honor, change, transition, celebration, or anything else that deserves time. He is wonderful for clearing space when we call upon him for help and forging spiritual connections. Call upon him for accessing and creating sacred space, cleansing ancestral karma, connecting to your own spirit, and accessing your ancestors or spiritual ancestors. Another thing that I thought was interesting, talking about that link between native guides and spiritualism, White Eagle was a big spirit guide who was popular. Estelle Roberts had Red Cloud, who was incredibly popular, but the other trance control guide, who was probably the most famous of all of those native spirit guides, was probably Silver Birch, who was the trance control or spirit guide of Maurice Barbanel, and whose teachings, much like White Eagle, are very much still a part of the philosophy of spiritualism and their teaching centers. So one thing that I thought was really interesting as I was learning about White Eagle is that White Eagle himself, actually, let me read this part here to you. So White Eagle wasn't really a Native American. It was a persona that was adopted because that spirit intelligence believed that if his channel, his medium, and those who listened to the teachings knew the true identity, that it would take away from the importance of the message, or that would overshadow the importance of the message, so it chose to remain anonymous and sort of adopt this personality. So here, White Eagle also chose this particular symbolic name because the Native Americans have a legend that the name White Eagle means a spiritual teacher, because the white eagle flies straight towards the sun. And that's kind of very similar, I guess I should say, to the spiritualist symbolism of the sunflower. In spiritualism, there's the quote or the saying, which is why the sunflower is one of the symbols. Like the sunflower turns its face towards the sun, may the light of spiritualism turn our hearts and minds towards the truth. So there's another little interesting parallel or connection there. I'm just sort of looking here. But very much I was talking about how White Eagle sort of was an adopted personality, and here's an example of White Eagle. It was Silver Birch, through the mediumship of Maurice Barbanel, who was very similar, that Silver Birch was just a name, just a random name that was given to the entity that came through and sort of adopted or used the persona of another spirit, of a native person's, so it could be more easily received by people, because I think oftentimes there's sort of a romanticized view of native culture. So the last sort of reference as far as White Eagle that I'll mention here was from the Encyclopedia of Angel Spirit Guides and Ascended Masters by Susan Gregg. And in it, she says, White Eagle will help you see your perfection, connect with your divinity, release your limitations, learn how to love unconditionally, heal the body, mind, and spirit. White Eagle's message is a familiar one. He knows the limitations that exist are ones we place on ourselves. So I'm not going to go as into the workings like I did when I taught this class sort of at Chesterfield or Lilydale, but it is something that was important for me to put out there in a virtual sense so it could reach more people. That being said, do you guys have any questions about anything we talked about? Spiritualism, root work, Conjure, Blackhawk, Mother Anderson, White Eagle. Just gonna scroll through here. Make sure there weren't any questions earlier on because I wasn't paying attention. Okay. Like I said, I know it's not the normal topic that I speak on, but there are a couple resources that I do want to give you. I mentioned some of those a moment ago when I was reading those quotes. If you're interested in further learning about Blackhawk or how to work with him in a conjure or root work perspective, Blackhawk Working with His Spirit by Mama Star Cassis is probably the best resource, as there's not a lot out there. There's several resources about Blackhawk's life, including a book that he dictated, his own autobiography. But as far as working with Blackhawk in a Southern spiritualist style or in a root work context, there's very limited information. So Blackhawk Working with His Spirit. And then there's a little bit of information in the New Orleans Handbook by Kinaz Phelan. I probably butchered that. I apologize to the author. And then there's a little bit, just a smidge on Blackhawk and the spiritual church movement of the South in Keys to Conjure. I believe that's by Chaz Bogan. That's a new release. I think that's from Llewellyn. But I hope you guys enjoyed my little history lesson for you today. If you have any questions or anything like that at all, just give me a shout, shoot me a message. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening.